We are taught that Napoleon Bonaparte lost his empire in the snows of Russia. We are taught that he was defeated by the winter and the Cossacks. But the truth is that his empire actually died 10 years earlier on a tropical island in the Caribbean. He didn't lose his power because of a military defeat in Europe. He lost it because he lost his bank account. He lost the Saudi Arabia of the 18th century, and the financial hole it left was so big that he had to set the rest of the world on fire just to try and fill it. This is Tom from the Collapse Log, exploring the rise and fall of empires. Because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay no one sees until it is too late. If you looked at a map of the world in the year 1789, you would see the massive, sprawling empires of Britain and France and Spain. You would see vast territories in North America and India and Africa. But if you looked at the financial ledgers of the French Empire, you would realize that most of those territories were worthless on paper. Canada was a frozen wasteland that cost more to defend than it produced. The Louisiana Territory was a vast, empty wilderness. But there was one tiny speck of land that mattered more than all the rest combined. It was the western third of the island of Hispaniola, a colony called Saint-Domingue known today as Haiti. To the modern eye, it is hard to comprehend just how important this small island was. In the 18th century, sugar was not just a sweetener, it was white gold. It was the most valuable commodity in global trade. It was the oil of its day, and Saint-Domingue was the supreme producer. By the late 1780s, this one colony produced 40% of all the sugar consumed in the world. It produced 60% of the world's coffee. It produced more wealth for France than all of the 13 American colonies produced for Great Britain combined. It was the engine of the French economy. The port of Bordeaux in France was built entirely on the trade with Saint-Domingue. The great mansions of the French aristocracy were built with the profits from Haitian sugar. The taxes on these goods funded the French navy and the French court. But this mountain of gold was built on a foundation of bones. The colony was a slaughterhouse. It was the most brutal slave system ever devised by human beings. 500,000 enslaved Africans worked the plantations under conditions so horrific that the average life expectancy upon arrival was just a few years. It was an economic machine that consumed human lives and spit out cash. When the French Revolution began in 1789, the shockwaves traveled across the ocean. The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue heard the slogans of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and they decided to take them literally. In 1791, the volcano erupted. The slaves rose up in a massive revolution led by a genius general named Toussaint Louverture. They burned the plantations. They destroyed the sugar mills. And most importantly, for our story, they stopped the flow of cash. Overnight, the economic engine of France seized up. The ships arriving in Bordeaux were empty. The sugar shortage in Paris caused riots. The tax revenue that the government relied on simply evaporated. For the next decade, France was in chaos. The revolutionary government tried to handle the situation by abolishing slavery in 1794, hoping to keep the colony loyal. Toussaint Louverture became the governor and nominally remained French, but he acted like an independent king. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte. When Napoleon seized power in 1799, he had a vision. We think of him as a conqueror of Europe, but his original dream was actually a North American empire. He wanted to rebuild the French colonial power. He looked at the map and saw a grand strategy. The Louisiana Territory would provide the food and the timber. Saint-Domingue would provide the sugar and the cash, and the Mississippi River would connect them. But for this plan to work, he needed Saint-Domingue back under total control. He needed the cash flow. He needed the blacks to go back to the fields and produce the sugar that paid for his army. Napoleon was a man of the Enlightenment, but on this issue he was a cold-blooded pragmatist. He famously said, "I am for the whites because I am white." He decided to reinstate slavery. He decided to turn the clock back. In 1801, he assembled a massive invasion force. He sent his own brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, with 20,000 of the best soldiers in France. These were veterans of the Rhine and Italy. They were the toughest troops in the world. Napoleon gave Leclerc secret instructions. He told him to lie to Toussaint Louverture, to promise him anything. And then once the French troops were in control, to arrest the black leaders, disarm the population, and restore slavery with absolute ruthlessness. It was supposed to be a police action. It was supposed to be easy. But Napoleon had made the classic mistake of the European imperialist. He underestimated the environment, and he underestimated the will of a people fighting for their own existence. The expedition started well. Leclerc landed and captured the major ports. Toussaint Louverture was tricked, arrested, and shipped to a prison cell in France where he would die of cold and starvation. Napoleon thought he had one. He sat in Paris, waiting for the ships full of sugar to start arriving again. He was already spending the money in his head, planning his next moves. But in the jungles of Haiti, a nightmare was unfolding. The news that Napoleon intended to bring back slavery leaked out. The population realized that this wasn't just a change of government. It was a sentence of death. The resistance exploded. It wasn't a conventional war anymore. It was a war of extermination. The Haitian generals like Jean-Jacques Dessalines burned their own cities to the ground so the French would have nowhere to sleep. They poisoned the wells. They fought with a ferocity that terrified the European veterans. And then the real enemy arrived, General Yellow Fever. The rainy season came, and with it came the mosquitoes. The French soldiers in their heavy wool uniforms had no immunity. They started dropping like flies. It starts with a headache and a fever. Then the skin turns yellow, then you start vomiting black blood, and then you die. The hospital reports from this time are terrifying. Entire regiments were wiped out in a week without firing a shot. General Leclerc wrote desperate letters to Napoleon. He said, "Send me more men, send me money, send me doctors." Napoleon kept pouring resources into the furnace. He sent another 10,000 men, then another. He emptied the depots of France. He sent the Polish legions. He sent the Dutch troops. They all died. General Leclerc himself caught the fever and died. The French army was reduced to a skeleton crew huddled in the coastal forts, afraid to go into the jungle. By 1803, it was over. Napoleon had lost more than 50,000 of his best soldiers. He had lost his brother-in-law. He had drained the French treasury trying to reconquer the island, and he had nothing to show for it. The sugar was gone. The plantations were ash. The colony was lost forever. This was the moment the dream of a North American empire died. And this is the moment the true financial reality hit Napoleon. He was sitting in his bathtub in the Tuileries Palace when he made the decision. He looked at the map. Without Saint-Domingue, Louisiana was useless to him. It was a massive liability that he couldn't defend against the British or the Americans. And he was broke. The Haitian expedition had been a financial catastrophe. He needed cash immediately to rebuild his army for the war that was brewing in Europe. So he summoned his ministers and ordered them to sell Louisiana to the Americans. Not just a piece of it, the whole thing. Thomas Jefferson's diplomats were in Paris, just trying to buy the city of New Orleans. They were shocked when Napoleon offered them the entire middle third of the continent. They bought it for $15 million. It works out to about 3 cents an acre. It was the greatest real estate deal in history for the Americans. But for Napoleon, it was a fire sale. It was a liquidation. He was pawning the family silver because he had lost his job. He famously said, "This accession of territory affirms forever the power of the United States, and I have given England a maritime rival who sooner or later will humble her pride." He was trying to spin it as a strategic victory, but in reality it was an admission of defeat. He was cashing out of the New World because he couldn't afford the rent. The loss of Haiti completely changed the trajectory of the Napoleonic Wars. Before this, Napoleon had hoped to build a commercial empire based on trade and colonies. He wanted France to be rich, like Britain. He wanted a merchant fleet and tropical commodities. But after 1803, that door was closed. He had no sugar, he had no coffee, he had no colonial revenue. This forced him to turn his eyes back to Europe. If he couldn't get wealth from the Caribbean, he would have to take it from his neighbors. This is the key to understanding the aggressive expansion of the French Empire from 1805 onwards. Why did Napoleon invade Austria? Why did he invade Prussia? Why did he loot Italy? Because he had to. He had created a military machine that was too expensive for the French state to support on its own. Without the external injection of cash from the colonies, he needed an external injection of cash from conquest. He replaced the sugar of Haiti with the gold of Vienna. He replaced the coffee of the Caribbean with the taxes of Berlin. He became a land pirate. The Grande Armée became a mechanism for stripping wealth from the continent to replace the hole in the budget left by the loss of Saint-Domingue. Historians often talk about Napoleon's ambition. They say he wanted to rule the world. But ambition is often driven by necessity. He was riding a tiger. He couldn't stop conquering because if he stopped, the money would run out. The British understood this perfectly. They knew that France was financially fragile. They used their own colonial wealth to fund every coalition against Napoleon. Britain still had Jamaica. Britain still had Barbados. Britain still had India. The money kept flowing into the Bank of England, allowing them to fight a forever war. France had lost its pearl. And that financial disadvantage eventually ground Napoleon down. When he invaded Russia in 1812, it was the ultimate desperate gamble. He wasn't just looking for glory. He was looking for a way to force Russia back into his economic system, to close the loop, to strangle Britain, and finally win the economic war. But we know how that ended. The ghosts of Haiti haunted Napoleon until the very end. On St. Helena, he admitted that the expedition was one of his greatest mistakes. He said, "I should have governed it through Toussaint." It was a rare admission of failure from a man with an enormous ego. But the story doesn't end with Napoleon. The financial shadow of this event stretched long into the future. The French state never forgave Haiti for the loss of its property. And in 1825, a decade after Napoleon was gone, the French returned. They didn't come with an invasion army this time. They came with warships and a bill. They parked their cannons in the harbor of Port-au-Prince and delivered an ultimatum. They demanded that the Haitian government pay a massive indemnity to France to compensate the slave owners for their lost property. They demanded 150 million francs. To put that into perspective, it was 10 times the annual budget of Haiti. It was more than Napoleon had sold the entire Louisiana Territory for. It was extortion, pure and simple. But the Haitian government, terrified of another invasion and another war, agreed to pay. This debt is what truly destroyed Haiti. To pay, the French Haiti had to take out predatory loans from French banks. They spent the next 122 years paying off the interest. The money that should have been used to build schools and roads and hospitals in Haiti was instead funneled back to Paris to pay for the great-grandchildren of the slave owners. It wasn't until 1947 that the debt was finally paid off. This is why Haiti is poor today. It is not because of corruption or bad culture or natural disasters, although those things played a role later. The root cause is that the country was born with a mortgage. Its wealth was stolen twice, first by the slavery that built France, and second by the debt that crippled its future. The story of the sugar bankruptcy teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of power. We tend to focus on the men on the horses, the generals, the emperors, the speeches, but the real history of the world is written in the ledgers. It is written in the flow of commodities: sugar, oil, microchips. Napoleon was a genius on the battlefield. He could outmaneuver any army in Europe, but he could not outmaneuver the balance sheet. When he lost the economic engine of his empire, the clock started ticking. He could win battles, he could capture capitals, he could rewrite the borders of the map, but he was fighting a war against gravity. He was trying to run a superpower on a deficit. The Louisiana Purchase is often celebrated in America as a triumph of diplomacy, but it was really the debris of a French financial crash. The United States got the Midwest for pennies because a group of former slaves on an island in the Caribbean defeated the greatest army in the world and bankrupted the emperor. It is a reminder that the world is interconnected in ways we rarely see. The fate of a peasant in Russia or a pioneer in America was decided by the price of sugar in Paris. And it is a reminder that economies built on exploitation are inherently unstable. The wealth of Saint-Domingue was staggering, but it was brittle. It relied on terror and violence. And when the terror stopped working, the wealth vanished overnight. Napoleon tried to rebuild that system of exploitation, and it cost him his crown. Today, we look at global supply chains, and we think they are permanent. We think the flow of cheap goods and resources will last forever, but behind every golden age lies a quiet decay, a dependency that we don't acknowledge, a debt that is waiting to come due. Napoleon found out the hard way that you cannot eat glory and you cannot pay your soldiers with prestige. You need the sugar, you need the gold, and when the pearl is lost, the empire is not far behind. The next time you look at a map of the United States or history book about the Napoleonic Wars, remember the invisible island that isn't there. Remember the smoke rising from the plantations of Saint-Domingue, because that is where the modern world was actually forged, in the fire of a slave revolt that broke the bank of the French Empire. This is Tom from the Collapse Log. The ledgers are closed, but the debt remains.